The sound of Alice's laughter cut through the room like a serrated blade, sharp and deliberate. It wasn't the kind of laugh that came from joy or warmth. It was laced with something darker, something mean. Joe stood there, frozen, clutching a half-empty wine glass that felt heavier with every passing second. The room was alive with chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of a dozen conversations. But all he could hear was her voice, dripping with mockery. "Oh, Joe," she drawled, leaning against the kitchen island, her crimson dress catching the light like a warning signal. "Still playing with your little table tennis paddle? What's next? A professional stamp collecting career." The words hung in the air, sharp and jagged, as the small crowd of relatives chuckled nervously, their eyes darting between Joe and Alice like spectators at a train wreck. Joe's jaw tightened, his fingers instinctively brushing the worn leather strap of his wristwatch. A gift from his late father, a man who had always believed in him. The watch felt like an anchor now, grounding him as the room seemed to tilt. He forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes, and took a slow sip of wine, the bitterness of it lingering on his tongue. Alice wasn't done. She tilted her head, her glossy lips curling into a smirk. "I mean seriously, Joe, when are you going to grow up? You're not some college kid anymore. Maybe it's time to stop chasing dreams and start facing reality." Her tone was light, almost playful, but the words landed like punches, each one hitting a little harder than the last. Joe's chest tightened, but he kept his composure, his grip tightening on the glass. He could feel the weight of the room's attention pressing down on him, the unspoken pity of his relatives mingling with the faint scent of roasted turkey and burnt candles. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat like a dammed river. Instead, he nodded, a small, defeated gesture, and turned away, his wristwatch ticking faintly, a reminder of time slipping through his fingers like sand. As he walked toward the patio, the cool night air hitting his face, he caught a glimpse of Alice in the reflection of the sliding glass door. She was still smiling, her red dress like a beacon of danger, her eyes glinting with something he couldn't quite place. He stepped outside, the wine glass trembling in his hand, and stared up at the dark sky, the stars blurred by the sting of unshed tears. The storm was coming. He didn't know it yet, but it was already brewing, just beneath the surface, waiting to break. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards settling. Joe sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty beer bottle sweating in his hand. The faint glow of the stove clock cast a pale light across the room, marking the hours slipping by. It was past midnight, and Alice had been in the bedroom for hours, or so he thought. Then he heard it, a muffled voice, soft and melodic, drifting down the hallway. It wasn't the sharp, biting tone she'd used at the family gathering earlier that day. No, this was different. This was the voice she used when she thought no one was listening, when she was trying to coax something, or someone, into her orbit. Joe felt his stomach twist. He set the bottle down carefully, the glass clinking softly against the table, and stood, his chair scraping against the tile. He moved quietly, his socked feet barely making a sound as he crept toward the bedroom. The door was cracked open, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. Alice was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to him, phone pressed to her ear. Her red dress from earlier hung over the chair, looking like a discarded skin. She was in a tank top now, her shoulders bare, her hair falling in loose waves down her back. I know, she whispered into the phone, her voice low and intimate. "But you have to understand, it's complicated. He's not who he used to be." Joe froze, his chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to barge in, to demand answers, but something held him back. Maybe it was the way she laughed softly, a sound he hadn't heard in months, or maybe it was the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, a gesture that felt too familiar, too private. He backed away, retreating to the kitchen, his mind racing. The beer bottle was still there, sweating on the table, but the taste was sour now, bitter. He drained it in one long pull, then tossed it into the recycling bin with a clatter. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet house. Over the next few days, Joe started noticing things. Small things at first. The way Alice's phone buzzed constantly, the way she'd angle the screen away from him when she checked it, The way she'd disappear into the bathroom for long stretches. The sound of her voice barely audible through the door. Then there were the absences, trips to the store that took hours, errands that stretched into the evening. She always had an excuse, always a reason, but the excuses felt flimsy, like paper stretched too thin. One night, he found a crumpled receipt in the pocket of her jeans when he was doing laundry. The paper was smooth under his fingers, the ink smudged but still legible. It was from a hotel downtown, a place with a rooftop bar and rooms that cost more than their mortgage payment. The date was from last week, a day when she'd said she was visiting her sister. He stared at it for a long time, his jaw tightening, before shoving it back into the pocket. Then there was the smell. It clung to her clothes, faint but unmistakable. A cologne that wasn't his. Woodsy, with a hint of spice, something expensive. He'd caught a whiff of it when she walked past him in the hallway, her hair still damp from the shower. She'd smiled at him, a quick, perfunctory thing, before disappearing into the bedroom. He'd stood there, his hands clenched into fists, the scent lingering in the air like a ghost. Joe started keeping a mental tally, a ledger of all the little things that didn't add up. The late-night calls, the locked phone, the receipts, the smell. They were pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to solve, but couldn't ignore. Every night, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, while Alice slept soundly beside him, her breathing steady and unbothered. He wanted to shake her, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat, heavy and unspoken. Instead, he watched. He waited, and the unease grew, a slow, creeping thing that settled deep in his bones. Joe was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels absent-mindedly, when Mike shuffled into the room. The kid's sneakers squeaked against the hardwood floor, a sound that usually made Joe smile. But tonight, Mike's energy was off. He wasn't bouncing around like usual or launching into one of his endless stories about school or video games. Instead, he stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his hoodie. "Hey, buddy," Joe said, hitting mute on the TV. "What's up?" Mike didn't answer right away. He just stared at the floor, his face half hidden under the hood. Joe felt a flicker of unease. "Mike," he pressed, softer this time. Mom's been taking me to meet this guy," Mike blurted out, his voice cracking slightly. He was fidgeting with the drawstrings of his hoodie, twisting them around his fingers like he was trying to strangle his own words. "She said he's like really important, that he's gonna sponsor her team or something." Joe's stomach dropped. He didn't want to overreact, but his instincts were screaming at him. "What guy?" he asked, keeping his tone calm, though his hands were already curling into fists on his knees. "I don't know," Mike muttered, still avoiding eye contact. I guess he's rich. He has this fancy car, and he took us out to dinner a couple times. Mom said he's like a big deal. She told me not to tell you." Joe's jaw tightened. He could feel the anger bubbling up, but he forced it down. This wasn't about him, it was about Mike. "Did she say why she didn't want me to know?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Mike shrugged, finally looking up. His eyes were wide, like he was scared he'd said too much. "She just said you wouldn't understand, that you'd get mad or something." Joe's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to punch something, but he couldn't, not in front of Mike. Instead, he took a deep breath and forced himself to focus. Did he say anything weird to you? Or do anything that made you uncomfortable?" Mike shook his head quickly. "No, he was like really nice. He gave me this gift card for some gaming store. But, I don't know. It felt kind of weird, you know? Like, why is he being so nice to me and Mom?" Joe's mind was racing. He thought about the late-night calls, the unfamiliar cologne, the way Alice had been dressing up more lately. He chalked it up to her being stressed about work. But now it all felt like pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to finish. "Thanks for telling me, Mike," Joe said finally, reaching out to ruffle his son's hair. "You did the right thing." Mike nodded, but he still looked uneasy. "Are you gonna talk to Mom?" "Yeah," Joe said, his voice low. "Yeah, I'm gonna talk to her." As Mike shuffled off to his room, Joe sat there, staring at the blank TV screen. His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He thought about the photo he'd found in Alice's purse a few weeks ago, a picture of her and some guy at a gala, her arm looped through his, smiling like she didn't have a care in the world. At the time, he'd convinced himself it was nothing. Just work. Just networking. But now he wasn't so sure. And the fact that Alice had dragged Mike into it, that she'd used their son as some kind of pawn in whatever game she was playing, made his blood boil. He stood up, pacing the room. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence, each one a reminder of how empty the house felt, even with Mike just down the hall. He stopped at the window, staring out at the dark street. Somewhere out there, Alice was probably with that guy, laughing, drinking, living her best life while he sat here, trying to hold it all together. And Mike, poor Mike, Joe's heart ached for him. The kid didn't deserve this. None of them did. Joe clenched his fists again, then forced himself to relax. He couldn't lose it. Not yet. He needed to stay calm, to think this through. But one thing was clear. Alice had crossed a line, and Joe wasn't going to let her get away with it. Joe stood in the living room, his chest heaving as the flickering light above cast jagged shadows across the walls. The air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Alice sat on the edge of the couch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her red nails tapping against her elbow. She didn't look at him, not really. Her gaze was fixed on some distant point beyond his shoulder, as if he were already fading into the background of her life. "I know, Alice," Joe said, his voice cracking under the weight of the words. He held up his phone, the screen glowing with the damning photo Mike had shown him earlier. "I know about him. About you." Alice's lips twitched, not into a smile, but into something colder, sharper. She tilted her head, her dark hair falling over one shoulder. "Know what exactly?" she asked, her tone light, almost mocking. "What do you think you know, Joe?" He felt the anger surge, hot and raw, but he clenched his fists to keep it in check. "Don't play dumb," he snapped. "Mike told me everything. The guy, the trips, the hotels." The word came out like a curse, and he watched her closely, waiting for some flicker of guilt, some sign that she cared at all. But Alice just sighed, as if he were a child throwing a tantrum. "Oh, Joe," she said, shaking her head. "You're always so dramatic, so insecure. Maybe if you spent less time obsessing over your little hobbies and more time actually being a man, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Joe's jaw tightened. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice low and trembling. "This is about you lying to me, about you using Mike as some kind of pawn in whatever twisted game you're playing." Alice's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she looked almost dangerous. "Using Mike?" she repeated, her voice rising. "I'm trying to give him opportunities you never could. Do you know how much that sponsorship could mean for his future? But no, you'd rather wallow in your mediocrity and drag us down with you." Joe took a step back, stunned. The flickering light above seemed to dim, casting the room into an eerie half-darkness. He glanced at the coffee table, where the shattered remains of a mug lay scattered, the one he'd dropped earlier when Mike had first told him the truth. It had been a gift from Alice years ago, back when they still laughed together, back when he still believed in her. "You're unbelievable," he said, his voice breaking. "You twist everything. You make it sound like I'm the villain here, but I'm not the one sneaking around, lying, cheating." "Cheating?" Alice interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "Is that what you're calling it? Because I seem to recall a marriage that stopped being a marriage a long time ago, Joe. Maybe if you'd paid attention to something other than your stupid sports and your little projects, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere for." She stopped herself, but the implication hung in the air like a poison. Joe felt his stomach turn. He wanted to yell, to scream, to make her understand the pain she'd caused, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just stood there, his hands trembling at his sides, as Alice leaned back against the couch, her posture relaxed, almost bored. The flickering light above finally went out, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Alice stood, her silhouette sharp against the pale glow of the streetlight outside. "You want the truth, Joe?" she said, her voice cold and steady. "Here it is. I'm done. I've been done for a long time, and if you can't handle that, then maybe you should ask yourself why you're so desperate to hold on to something that's already gone." She walked past him, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, and disappeared into the hallway. Joe stood frozen, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a stone. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a reminder of the life they'd built together, or at least, the life he'd thought they had. He looked down at the shattered mug again, the pieces glinting in the dim light. Broken just like everything else. The office smelled faintly of stale coffee and the musty paper of old books. Joe sat slumped in his chair, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. His fingers brushed the edge of the wedding photo he'd pulled from a dusty box in the closet. The glass was smudged, and the frame felt heavier than he remembered. In the picture, Alice was radiant, her smile wide and her eyes sparkling with what he'd once believed was love. He looked at his own face, younger, softer, brimming with a naive optimism that now felt like a cruel joke. Was any of it real? Had she ever loved him? Or was he just a stepping stone to whatever life she'd been chasing? He traced the outline of her figure in the photo, his chest tightening as the memories flooded back. Their first date at that little Italian place downtown, where she'd laughed so hard at his terrible jokes that she'd spilled wine on her dress. The way she'd looked at him when he proposed, tears in her eyes, her voice trembling as she said yes. The birth of Mike, when she'd held their son for the first time and whispered, "We did it, Joe. We made a family." But now, those moments felt like scenes from a movie he'd watched years ago. Vivid but distant, disconnected from the reality he was living. The woman in the photo wasn't the same person who'd mocked him in front of their family, who'd lied to him, who'd betrayed him in ways he was still trying to comprehend. His eyes flicked to the stack of unpaid bills on his desk, the red stamps screaming at him like accusations. He hadn't even known about them until yesterday. How long had she been hiding this? How deep did the lies go? The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to grow louder, each second a reminder of the time slipping away. He clenched his fists, the anger bubbling up again, raw and unfocused. He wanted to scream, to break something, to demand answers from a woman who'd already proven she had none worth hearing. But instead, he sat there, the weight of his exhaustion pressing down on him like a physical force. He thought about the late-night phone calls, the scent of that unfamiliar cologne, the way she'd flinched when he'd asked her where she'd been. He thought about the way she'd looked at him during their argument, her eyes cold and calculating, as if she were weighing her options rather than fighting for their marriage. And then there was Mike. His sweet, innocent boy, caught in the middle of a mess he didn't understand. Joe's stomach churned at the thought of how much his son might have seen, how much he might have internalized. The photo slipped from his hands, landing face down on the desk with a soft thud. He couldn't look at it anymore. It was too painful, too confusing. He reached for the bills instead, flipping through them with a growing sense of dread. Credit card statements, loan notices, overdue utilities. Each one a piece of the puzzle he hadn't even known existed. How had he missed this? How had he been so blind? The anger flared again, hot and sharp, but it was quickly smothered by a wave of guilt. He should have seen the signs. He should have known something was wrong. But he'd been too busy, too trusting, too wrapped up in the illusion of their happy little life to notice the cracks forming beneath the surface. The clock ticked on, relentless, and Joe leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He felt hollowed out, like someone had taken a spoon to his insides and scraped away everything that mattered. But beneath the numbness, there was something else, a faint, flickering spark of resolve. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but he knew he couldn't keep sitting here, drowning in his own despair. The wedding photo still lay on the desk, face down, but he didn't turn it over. He didn't need to. The image was burned into his mind, a ghost of a life that no longer existed. And as the clock continued its relentless march, Joe made a silent promise to himself. No matter how much it hurt, he wouldn't let Alice's lies define him anymore. He'd find a way to move forward, for Mike's sake, and for his own. But for now, he just sat there, the weight of the past pressing down on him, and let the ticking of the clock fill the silence. Joe sat at the kitchen table, the overhead light casting a harsh glare on the papers spread out before him. His hands trembled as he flipped through the stack of bank statements, each one a new punch to the gut. The numbers didn't add up, not even close. His eyes scanned the columns, tracing the trail of withdrawals and charges that seemed to spiral into a black hole. A $2,500 charge at a high-end resort last month. A $1,200 shopping spree at a boutique he'd never heard of. And then there were the ATM withdrawals, $500 here, $300 there, always in cash, always untraceable. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and betrayal. He reached for his mug, only to realize it was empty. His fingers brushed against the mountain of credit card statements, each one a testament to Alice's deceit. The edges of the papers were crumpled, as if she'd tried to hide them in a hurry. He could almost see her, standing in the same kitchen, stuffing them into a drawer with that false smile she'd perfected over the years. His throat tightened as he pulled out the savings account statement. The balance read $47.32. $47. He stared at the number, his mind racing back to the promises they'd made when they first opened that account. For Mike's future, she'd said, her voice soft and sincere. Now it was almost empty, drained by her lies. A cold wave of anger washed over him, sharp and unrelenting. He clenched his fists, the paper crumpling in his grip. And then he saw it, a loan document tucked beneath the stack. His breath hitched as he unfolded it, his eyes darting to the signature at the bottom. It was his name, but the handwriting was all wrong. Too neat, too deliberate. Forgery. His stomach churned as he realized the depth of her betrayal. She hadn't just stolen from him. She dragged his name into her mess, signing his life away without a second thought. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound echoed in the quiet house, a jarring reminder of how empty it felt now. He paced the room, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Rage, heartbreak, and a gnawing sense of failure. How had he missed this? How had he let her blind him for so long? The sound of Mike's footsteps upstairs snapped him back to reality. He froze, his heart pounding as he listened to the faint creak of the floorboards. He couldn't let his son see him like this, broken, unraveling. With a deep breath, he gathered the papers, stuffing them back into the envelope. His hands still shook, but his resolve was hardening. He needed answers. He needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. As he slid the envelope into his briefcase, his eyes caught on the clock. It was nearly midnight. The house was quiet again, the silence heavy with unspoken words. He sat back down, staring at the empty coffee mug. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the room, a steady, grounding sound. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name of a financial advisor he'd met years ago at a work conference. His thumb hovered over the call button, hesitating. But then he thought of Mike, asleep upstairs, unaware of the storm raging beneath their roof. He thought of the life they'd built, now crumbling under the weight of Alice's lies. His jaw tightened, and he hit the call button. The phone rang once, twice before going to voicemail. He left a message, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "This is Joe. I need your help. It's about my wife and the money." As he hung up, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was tempered by something else, determination. He wouldn't let her destroy everything, not without a fight. The envelope sat in his briefcase, a ticking time bomb of secrets waiting to explode. But for now, all he could do was wait. Wait for the advisor to call back. Wait for the truth to come to light. And wait for the moment when he could finally confront Alice with the evidence of her betrayal. The clock ticked on, each second a reminder of the time slipping away. Joe sat in the dim light, his mind racing with questions and possibilities. But one thing was certain, whatever came next, he wouldn't let her take anything else from him. Not his money, not his dignity, and definitely not his son. Joe sat on the edge of Mike's bed, the weight of the conversation pressing down on his chest like a stack of bricks. The room smelled faintly of the cinnamon candle Alice had bought last Christmas. Ironic, he thought, how something so small could still linger when so much else had already crumbled. Mike sat cross-legged on the bed, his favorite stuffed dog tucked under one arm, his eyes wide and searching. The dim glow from the bedside lamp cast shadows that made his tear-streaked face look older than it should have. Joe's heart ached at the sight. "Buddy," Joe began, his voice steady but laced with a pain he couldn't fully hide. "Your mom and I, we need some time apart." The words felt like shards of glass in his throat, each one cutting deeper as he spoke them. Mike's lower lip quivered, and he clutched the stuffed dog tighter, as if it could shield him from the storm brewing in his father's voice. "Why?" Mike asked, his voice small and trembling. "Did I do something wrong?" Joe's stomach twisted. He reached out, placing a hand on Mike's knee, his fingers trembling slightly. No, buddy. This has nothing to do with you. You've been amazing. This is about grown-up stuff. Stuff your mom and I need to figure out on our own." Mike sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "But why can't you figure it out together? Like you always do?" Joe swallowed hard, his mind racing for the right words. He wanted to scream, to tell Mike the truth about Alice's late-night calls, the secret meetings, the way she'd turned their home into a minefield of lies. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not like this. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "when grown-ups have problems, they need space to figure things out. And that's what your mom and I need right now. Space." Mike's eyes filled with fresh tears, and he buried his face in the stuffed dog's fur. Joe felt a surge of anger. Not at Mike, but at Alice, at the way her choices had forced him into this impossible position. He wanted to protect his son, to shield him from the ugliness of it all, but he also knew Mike deserved some semblance of the truth. "I don't want you to go," Mike whispered, his voice muffled by the toy. "I'm not going anywhere, buddy," Joe said, his voice firm now. "I'll always be here for you. Always. But your mom, she's gonna stay somewhere else for a while. Just for a little bit." Mike looked up, his eyes red and puffy. "Is she coming back?" Joe hesitated, the question hitting him like a punch to the gut. He glanced at the suitcase sitting by the door, packed and ready for Alice to leave. It felt like a betrayal, like a final nail in the coffin of the life they'd built together. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "But no matter what happens, you and I, we're a team, okay?" Mike nodded slowly, though his expression was still clouded with confusion and hurt. Joe pulled him into a tight hug, breathing in the scent of his son's shampoo, something familiar and grounding in the midst of all the chaos. Over Mike's shoulder, Joe's eyes landed on the family photo on the nightstand. It was turned face down, the frame catching the faint light from the lamp. He didn't remember turning it over, but it felt right somehow, like a silent acknowledgement of the life they were leaving behind. "I love you, Dad," Mike murmured into his shoulder. "I love you too, buddy," Joe replied, his voice cracking just slightly. "More than anything." As he held his son, Joe felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. Anger, sadness, but also a fierce determination. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. No matter what Alice did, no matter how much she tried to twist the knife, he would protect Mike. He would be the rock his son needed, even if it meant standing alone in the storm. When Mike finally pulled away, his tears had slowed, though his face was still pale and drawn. Joe ruffled his hair, forcing a small smile. "How about we watch a movie tonight? Just you and me. We can even make popcorn." Mike nodded, a flicker of hope breaking through the sadness. "Can we watch the one with the dragons?" "Absolutely," Joe said, standing and offering his hand. As they walked downstairs together, Joe couldn't help but glance back at the suitcase by the door. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, but also a reminder of what he was fighting for. Alice might be leaving, but he wasn't. Not now, not ever. The sound of Alice's car engine sputtered to life, cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over the house. Joe stood at the living room window, his fingers gripping the edge of the curtain, as he watched her load the last of her suitcases into the trunk. She didn't look back. Not once. Her red dress, the same one she'd worn at the family gathering that felt like a lifetime ago, caught the sunlight as she slammed the trunk shut. It was almost poetic, he thought, how something so vibrant could now feel so hollow. Her car rolled down the street, tires crunching over gravel, and then it was gone. Just like that. The house felt different, emptier somehow, even though her presence had been more of a shadow lately than anything real. Joe exhaled, a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Relief washed over him in waves, but it wasn't clean or pure. It was tangled with something heavier, a sadness that clung to his ribs like a weight he couldn't shake. He turned away from the window, his eyes landing on the table tennis paddle propped against the wall. It had been months since he'd picked it up, the handle gathering dust alongside the rest of his old life. He walked over, running his fingers along the worn grip, the familiar texture grounding him. The paddle felt solid in his hands, a reminder of who he used to be before everything had unraveled. He didn't know if he could get that version of himself back. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted to try. The phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the quiet. He pulled it out, half expecting, half dreading, to see Alice's name on the screen. But it was just a reminder for Mike's soccer game tomorrow. Joe stared at the notification, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He'd be there, front and center, cheering his son on. That much at least hadn't changed. He wandered into the kitchen, the faint scent of coffee still lingering in the air from that morning. On the windowsill, the orchid he'd bought on a whim a few weeks ago was starting to bloom, its delicate petals unfurling in the afternoon light. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, just something to fill the empty space where Alice's plants used to sit. But now, watching the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, he felt a strange sense of hope. Maybe this was what starting over looked like, small, quiet moments that added up to something bigger. Later that evening, after Mike had gone to bed, Joe found himself in the garage, digging through boxes he hadn't touched in years. Trophies, old photos, a stack of table tennis magazines. Memories of a life that felt both familiar and foreign. He pulled out a framed picture of himself from a tournament years ago, his younger self grinning back at him with a confidence he barely recognized. He set it on the workbench next to his paddle, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him. A flicker of determination, a spark of the man he used to be. The house was quiet now, the kind of quiet that could either swallow you whole or give you room to breathe. Joe chose the latter. He picked up the paddle, testing its weight in his hand, and made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew one thing for certain. He was done letting Alice's shadow define him. The road ahead was uncharted, but for the first time in months, he felt ready to walk it. The gymnasium buzzed with energy, the rhythmic thwack of paddles against balls echoing like a heartbeat. Joe stood at the edge of the table, sweat dripping down his temple, his grip tightening on the paddle. It wasn't just a game anymore. It was a battle against everything he'd lost. The crowd's cheers were a distant hum, their faces blurring into a sea of motion. All he could see was the ball, spinning toward him like a metaphor for his life. Fast, unpredictable, but still within his reach. He lunged, his body moving on instinct, and sent the ball screaming across the table. His opponent, a younger guy with a cocky grin, scrambled to return it, but Joe was already there, slamming it back with a precision that made the crowd erupt. The match point. The ball hit the edge of the table and skidded off, impossible to return. The referee's whistle blew, and just like that, it was over. Joe stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, the weight of the paddle in his hand grounding him. The trophy gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its polished surface reflecting the faces of the crowd. He'd forgotten what this felt like, not just winning but belonging. For the first time in months, he felt like more than the shell of a man Alice had left behind. As he stepped forward to accept the trophy, the applause washed over him like a warm tide. Faces he recognized from the local club were smiling, clapping, shouting his name. Mike was there too, his son's face lit up with pride. Joe's throat tightened, but he swallowed the emotion down, forcing a grin as he raised the trophy high. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was proof. Proof that he could still fight, that he could still win. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Alice had been texting sporadically since the separation, her messages veering between passive-aggressive and pleading. They always came at the worst moments, when he was trying to sleep, when he was with Mike, when he was finally starting to feel like himself again. He'd stopped answering weeks ago, but the notifications still felt like little jabs, reminders of the life he was trying to leave behind. "Dad, that was awesome." Mike's voice cut through his thoughts, and Joe turned to see his son barreling toward him, a grin splitting his face. Joe ruffled his hair, the weight of the trophy in his other hand feeling lighter now. "Thanks, kid," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Couldn't have done it without you cheering me on." Mike's grin widened, and for a moment, Joe could almost forget the mess his life had become. Almost. But as they walked out of the gym, the trophy tucked under his arm, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The victory wasn't just about table tennis. It was about proving to himself that he could still stand tall, even when everything else had crumbled. The parking lot was quiet now, the echo of the crowd fading into the night. Joe loaded the trophy into the trunk, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. He glanced at his phone again, the screen lighting up with another text from Alice. This time he didn't ignore it. He deleted it without reading, his jaw tightening as he slid the phone back into his pocket. Mike climbed into the passenger seat, chattering about the match, but Joe's mind was elsewhere. He stared at the dark road ahead, the streetlights casting long shadows. The trophy was a start, but it wasn't the end. He still had a long way to go, and he wasn't sure where the road would lead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to find out. The diner was exactly as Joe remembered it. The cracked vinyl booths, the faint hum of the jukebox in the corner, and the smell of grease and coffee that clung to the air like an old friend. But tonight it felt different. The neon sign outside flickered weakly, casting a soft pink glow over the table where he sat with Mike. His son was slurping loudly on a shared milkshake, the straw making that obnoxious sound Joe used to scold him for. Tonight he let it slide. Mike had picked the spot, insisting they go to their usual place. Joe had hesitated at first, wondering if the memories tied to this booth would sting too much. But as he watched Mike fidget with the wrapper of his straw, rolling it into a tight little ball, Joe realized something. This wasn't Alice's diner anymore. It was theirs. A place where father and son could sit and talk, or not talk, without the weight of her presence hanging over them. You know, Joe started, his voice raspy from days of too much silence and too many cigarettes. I used to think this place was just a pit stop, somewhere to grab a bite before life got back to being complicated. He paused, staring at the milkshake glass, condensation pooling at its base. But now I think it's more than that. It's ours. Mike looked up, his eyes wide and a little unsure. He was 12 now, but sometimes, like when the light caught his face just right, Joe could still see the little boy who used to climb into his lap and demand bedtime stories. That boy was still in there, buried under layers of confusion and hurt. Joe hated that he couldn't shield him from all of it. You doing okay, buddy? Joe asked, his voice softer now. Mike shrugged, a gesture so familiar it made Joe's chest ache. I guess. I mean, it's weird, you know? Not having Mom around. But... He trailed off, picking at the edge of the table with his fingernail. It's kinda nice, too. Just us. Joe nodded, swallowing hard. He'd spent so much time trying to hold it together for Mike, to be the steady, unshakable rock his son needed. But tonight, sitting in this booth with the milkshake between them and the faint sound of some old rock song playing in the background, Joe felt the cracks in his facade start to show. I'm sorry, he said finally, the words catching in his throat. For everything. For not seeing it sooner. For letting her. He stopped himself, glancing at Mike. For not protecting you better. Mike looked at him, his face serious in a way that made him seem older than his years. It's not your fault, Dad. She's the one who messed up. Not you. Joe blinked, surprised by the clarity in his son's voice. Mike had always been quiet, the kind of kid who internalized everything, and Joe had worried that the fallout from Alice's betrayal would bury him under layers of resentment and confusion. But here he was, sitting across from him, offering the kind of wisdom that only comes from being forced to grow up too fast. You're a good kid, you know that? Joe said, reaching across the table to ruffle Mike's hair. Better than I deserve. Mike grinned, the first real smile Joe had seen from him in weeks. You're not so bad yourself, old man. The waitress came by to refill their coffee, her apron stained with ketchup and her smile tired but kind. Joe watched her pour the steaming liquid into his cup, the rich aroma mingling with the scent of fries and syrup. It was a small moment, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like a reminder that life went on, that even after everything, the lies, the heartbreak, the nights spent staring at the ceiling wondering where it all went wrong, there were still moments like this, quiet, simple, real. As they left the diner, the neon sign buzzing faintly above them, Mike handed Joe a small wrapped box. I got you something, he said, his cheeks flushing. It's not much, but I thought you might like it. Joe unwrapped it carefully, his fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a new wristwatch, its face gleaming under the streetlights. It wasn't fancy or expensive, but it was perfect. I thought you could use a new one, Mike said, his voice hesitant. since the old one kinda stopped working. Joe stared at the watch, his throat tight. The old one, the one his father had given him years ago, had been a constant reminder of everything he'd lost. But this one, this simple, unassuming watch, felt like a promise. A reminder that time didn't stop, even when it felt like it should. "Thanks, buddy," Joe said, pulling Mike into a hug. "This means more than you know." As they walked to the car, the neon sign flickered one last time before steadying into a steady glow. Joe glanced back at it, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still bills to pay, wounds to heal, and a future to figure out. But for the first time in a long time, Joe felt like he could face it. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. For Mike, for himself, for the life they were building, one milkshake and one quiet diner night at a time.